intended use, as the border was cut off and put away. Since it was never used, it has retained its original color and its glaze. Another highlight is the blue silk dress that you see here that belonged to Miriam Lord and was worn at her wedding to Richard Manning in Ipswich in 1776. Miriam was Nathaniel Hawthorne's grandmother, and Richard was a blacksmith before he founded the Salem and Boston Stagecoach Company, whose success supported his large family. And he needed a good business and a large house. The couple had 9 children who grew into adulthood. Besides his home in Salem, Richard Manning had significant land holdings in Maine, enough so that his son Richard moved the family to Casco in 1795 to manage family properties. The federal house he built in Casco still stands, and I believe Casco is not very far from Berwick. The dress is made of a precious deep blue Chinese export silk damask, which would have undertaken a voyage across the globe that may have lasted as long as a year. Miriam's grandson, who ultimately handled the family estate, remembered Miriam as stern and parsimonious. This frugality may be the reason her wedding gown was updated some 30 years later. The dress's remaking, likely more than once, shows how valuable every scrap of this Chinese silk could be. The bodice and front of the dress are a patchwork of 10 or more pieces, and the back is no different than the front, by the way. The pattern of the silk damask is typical of what were then called India damasks, although their country of origin was China. These silks were exported to the colonies via the British East India Company, hence their name. In contrast to English damasks that were stiff and heavy, India damasks were supple and woven wider. A standard English damask is approximately 19 inches wide. A Chinese export damask is anywhere from 28 to 33 inches wide. And on the right is an English damask, and on the left, the Chinese export damask that you see on that dress. Chinese export silks almost always have horizontal repeat patterning and short vertical repeats. So here you see the design repeated 3 times horizontally, and the repeat itself in this particular silk is less than 30 inches. This silk is 19 inches wide, so it's significantly narrower, and the repeat is over 5 feet. So if you're trying to make something, if you're trying to upholster something, it's very difficult when you have this very, very large pattern. And I think that this may account for some of the reasons that these export silks were so popular, in both for interior furnishings as bed hangings, wall hangings, and as an addition to dress. At the time that it was woven, in about 1775, Chinese export silks were illegal in England, but these textiles could be re-exported to the American colonies, a lucrative and captive market. Also Chinese export from the collection is a gray China silk day dress dating to the 1830s. The term China silk is still in use today for light plain woven silk. The dress with its separate collar probably weighs less than a pound, and it must have been a dream to wear, light on the body, smooth to the touch, and shimmering in the light. Besides the palampour border fragments and the dress that we saw earlier, these 2 woven kerchiefs with the initials MM, presumably for Miriam Manning, and 1 woven man's cravat, both from India, plus 2 bandanas. Seen on the right, a yellow tie-dyed Indian bandana, and on the left, a colorful block printed one known as a chopa. The bandana is one of India's most enduring introductions to the Western wardrobe. Who has not had a bandana? From the time these colorful squares of silk first landed on European shores in the 1720s, they have enjoyed near constant popularity, gaining new and varied cultural associations, even as they have remained an enduring symbol of working class fashion. Like Chinese silks and Indian chintz, bandanas were prohibited for domestic use in England in the 18th century, but legal for re-export to America. They were worn by both men and women around the neck or shoulders, later in the pocket of men's coats, and sometimes around the waist. In this 1789 portrait of the Connecticut merchant Elijah Boardman, now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, we see a number of fabrics that appear to be export. And on this really looks to me like Chinese export silk. And this up here looks like Indian cloth that's been tie-dyed. However, it is also possible that these two textiles may be English imitations made in Manchester. In 1835, the East India Company reportedly imported 188,000 chopas to Britain. However, by the second half of the 19th century, English block printed copies had all but eliminated the need for Indian imports. Another dress that belonged to Miriam Manning is of Indian painted cotton. Like silks, Indian cottons were luxury goods that made their way to the American colonies. The dress, made of painted and mordant-dyed cloth, so same cloth as the palampour, is executed with the same technique. Throughout the 18th century, painted and dyed Indian cottons like this were highly desirable, if not expensive, because they were both lightweight and color fast. They also conveyed status. The increasing lack of availability of Indian printed cloth helped encourage the development and manufacture of like material in the West, although it is not until the second half of the 19th century that European block printers could achieve the same color fastness. Like the damask dress, this textile could have been yard goods for home furnishing, whereas we see it here in a dress. Also, like the blue dress, this one has been remade several times. The cotton dates to the 1770s, but the style reflects the fashionable silhouette of the beginning of the 19th century. The collection that we have just seen says a lot about the availability of cloth in Salem in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and the diversity and at the same time commonality in design, especially with the Tree of Life motif and its many variations. The Tree of Life seen on the palampour is unmistakably Indian in design and technique, but global in its commercial reach. While the origin of the Tree of Life is thought to come from Persian manuscripts, they themselves derive from early Chinese paintings. The motif acquired its distinctive form during the 17th century when Indian artists combined Eastern and Western influences, adapting the Tree of Life design to European tastes. These surviving textiles from Ashburnham House in Sussex show the profound influence India had on European and American design sensibilities and the extraordinary sophistication of cross-cultural commerce. Both late 17 exports from India, the chintz on the left was made on the eastern Coromandel coast of India, and on the right, with an identical design, embroidered in fine silk on cotton, on the northwestern coast, and the distance between these two places is 1,200 miles. The Ashburnham hangings are some of the earliest documented examples of these motifs and shows the clear influence on English embroidery and eventually on American crewel work. Designed with the same pattern of trees, hillocks, and oriental figures is a set of crewel bed hangings made for Cullen House in Banffshire, Scotland, a fragment of which we see here. And all of these pieces, I guess all of these pieces are at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, although pieces from this collection are dispersed variously between the Victorian Albert, the Royal Ontario Museum, and I guess the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Here, another English crewel bed hanging on the right, and on the left is a detail of the Ashburnham. Is an English crewel work inspired by the hangings from Ashburnham, also worked in wool on fustian with a very similar design. Both show no particular regard for botanical accuracy in their depiction of trees with branches flowering completely different species of fantastical flowers. Airy and vibrant designs like this are typical of what is seen in domestic work produced during most of the 18th century, and show how great the appeal was for the colorful exoticism of Eastern design and how it could be adapted to Western taste. Given their political and economic and cultural ties, it is not surprising that American embroideries were influenced by those made in Britain. The design of crewelwork bed curtains, so popular in early 18th century Britain, was also the norm in the colonies and the early Republic. Even though this bed curtain is probably English, it has a sparseness and a naivete that one generally doesn't associate with English work, and shows a stylistic transition that relates to American crewel. The sparseness of the design might otherwise point to a New England origin, but the intricate laid work and at least 27 different patterns and color combination makes this curtain more distinctive work done in Great Britain. On the other hand, the Lowell family curtain is very typical of American embroidery of the early to mid 18th century. With flowering trees growing from a mound, the easy availability of homespun wool and linen meant that crewelwork was by and large the preferred technique for embroidery. Imported cotton would have been much more expensive. The Lowell curtains at the MFA, Boston, bear a close resemblance to the previous set, also in the filling patterns, but the line drawing is thinner, and already the use of open space is used to full advantage. When and why the differences in English and American crewel occurred is hard to pinpoint absolutely. More open patterning, the use of less material, the preference for remaining in couching rather than satin stitch, saves enormously on thread. This sort of thrift is not unique to America, but in the popular technique of crewelwork embroidery, it is characteristic of the colonies. Other examples with the Tree of Life are this Boston piece, which, like the Lowell curtain, shows the close relationship to Indian exoticism, as well as British crewel with flowering trees and elaborate filling patterns. But it also gives a sense of the economical use of worsted in colonial America through its widely spaced motifs. Also distinctive in the last two pieces is the use of a plain rather than a fancy linen. And you probably all know this, but a fancy linen is a linen that has a woven pattern ground as opposed to a plain woven ground. By the second half of the 18th century, the motifs seen in American crewelwork became abstracted and more removed from their Indian and English forebears, although the influence is still present. This bed set, made in the 1760s and 70s in Western Massachusetts, and now at historic Deerfield, shows the flowering vines that we saw on the Boston curtains in a new composition that is devoid of landscape and spread out, with large areas of linen ground left visible. I'm often asked, how do you find things? Where do you look? Well, sometimes pieces just come to you. So my brother lives in Salisbury, Connecticut, and he was having his house painted. And the house painter, finding out, because I lived across the street, that I was in the antiques business in Delton Textiles, said, I have a piece and I think it's old. Will you look at it and tell me what it is? And that piece is the valance that you see here. It's this piece. That was the missing piece to the bed set at historic Deerfield that came from the Ashley family and was passed down through a different side of the family. It's a miracle when pieces from the past can be united. And of course, this is the greatest miracle of all, the set of bed hangings made by Mary Sweet Bullman of York, Maine, now at the Old York Historical Society. And if you haven't seen them, they're well worth, for you, maybe not so far, but they're worth the trip all the way to Maine. The influence of Asian models is seen in not only domestic textiles, but also professionally printed textiles throughout the 18th century, when European printers, and especially the English, developed dyeing techniques to print textiles in imitation of Indian designs. This palimpore from the collection at the Victorian Albert, dating to the second quarter of the 18th century, shows a central medallion with a vase of flowers surrounded by a field of floral sprays and bordered with bouquets set out in a scrolling pattern. The vase motif is ubiquitous in 18th century Western design. Clearly a European design idea sent to India to be incorporated in product for the Western export market. In 1784, as the first ships from Asia began to trade directly with India after the American Revolution, Large numbers of palampours, sized to be coverlets like this, were being imported, including to the port of Philadelphia. This magnificent coverlet, and this piece is another miracle because of its condition, is made by John Hewson, and is one of approximately 30 surviving pieces of its work. Like palampours, it has a central vase and bouquets of flowers in the four corners with a repeating border surround. Hewson, a Revolutionary War patriot from Philadelphia, immigrated from England to the US in 1774 with the help of Benjamin Franklin. Having worked for Oliver and Talwin, a leading textile print works in London, he set up the Calico Print Factory the same year he arrived. He traveled from England with workers that were trained printers. Houston used woodblocks to print chintz fabrics in up to 7 colors. He printed yard goods, scarves, and whole cloth coverlets like this. His artistry is such that today textile historians still consider him one of the finest craftsmen in textile printing history. An advertisement placed by Hewson in the Pennsylvania Packet, April 1st, 1770, implies he intended to compete directly with Indian products. Quote, "A favorable opportunity now presents itself for carrying on the business of calico printing in this country extensively and with great advantage, particularly to those concerned in the East India trade, who have it in their power to reap man and great benefits that are peculiar to those only. Any person or persons willing to enter into the above-mentioned branch of business in an extensive manner may have further information or subject by applying to John Hewson Company," end quote. Even into the 19th century, coverlets with the design idea of the Tree of Life were being made. This Tree of Life applique chintz coverlet is made entirely with English and American manufactured printed cloth and dates to the mid-19th century. Clothing of trade cloth was widely worn in New England. This dress, consisting of a skirt and petticoat, gifted by Cora to Colonial Williamsburg, was worn by Annie Van Rensselaer of Albany. Found in Massachusetts is this banyan with abstracted floral vines similar to known Indian trade cloth pieces made for the Indonesian market, and this is now at historic Deerfield. This early 19th century banyan from Rye, New York, is of a cloth circa 1780, imitating chintz, that is possibly of American manufacture. Clothing of textiles made of silk include this panel of a woman's dress seen on the right, embroidered in silk on Chinese export silk ground, which would have been an expensive indulgence. The embroidery is almost identical to that on a dress made and worn by Elizabeth Bull of Boston for her wedding in 1735, and rather inventively remade in the 1830s. Other Chinese silks imported to the American colonies included painted silk taffetas and gauzes with eye-popping colors and luster, which were used for interior upholstery and hangings as well as dress. So anybody who thinks that there wasn't color in the 18th century has to look at this piece. You need sunglasses. This gauze on the right is similar to fragments of a similar painted gauze, the remnants of a dress at Colonial Williamsburg. Here, a robe à l'anglaise with petticoat, now at the Kyoto Costume Institute, that was found by Cora in a bag being discarded. Another dress with American provenance is this yellow painted silk polonaise, now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And this dress would have had the same kind of, eye-popping color that the blue silk you saw has. It's just this has been used and rubbed and lost a lot of its surface paint. And finally, an example of English painted silk made to look like it's Chinese. It's not always so easy to tell the difference, but selvage width, selvage markings, and the application of paint is usually the giveaway in determining the country of origin. Although Chinese painted dress silks like those we have just seen, and silk damasks with exotic-looking florals and foliage enjoyed special popularity among fashionable ladies in the 18th century, Brocaded silks produced in China in imitation of Western designs were also being imported. This Chinese export brocaded panel with self-figured ground is especially rare in that it specifically mimics the delicate naturalistic style of the flowered silks produced in Spitalfields, London in the 1740s. The drawing on the right is for a design for a silk brocade by Anna Maria Garthwaite, whose extensive archive of designs is preserved at the Victoria and Albert. And you can see that these self-figured ground patterns, these that are white, are interspersed with brocaded patterns in colored silk with the same compositional idea. The popularity of Chinese brocades was such that weavers in Amsterdam produced silks that, like the English painted silk, may have been meant to deceive the buyer. For a brief period in the 1730s, weavers in Amsterdam produced an extraordinary and distinctive array of silks, incorporating the latest trend sweeping Europe, chinoiserie. Unlike England and France, which enacted bans on Chinese silks to protect their native textile industries, the Netherlands had no such prohibitions. Still, that didn't stop the savvy Dutch businessmen from capitalizing on the demand by producing their own silks that looked like the expensive Eastern originals. At the same time, silks like these were used for women's dress and men's formal and informal attire. A cartouche in the border of a similar silk contains a woven mock Chinese inscription, presumably intended to make it appear to be genuine Chinese textile. And here's the inscription here. Nobody thinks it says anything. Some people have even suggested that it might not even be Chinese, that it might have been intended to be in Gujarati. Yeah. The dress, now at the MFA Boston, was collected by Elizabeth Day McCormick, and although there is no evidence that it was worn in the colonies, there is no reason to think that silks of this type were not used in America. No discussion of the global textile trade would be complete without talking about one of the oldest and most highly valuable fabrics, muslin. Since antiquity, muslins from present-day Bengal enjoyed unrivaled fame for their diaphanous appearance and their exceedingly high thread counts. The deceptive simplicity of muslin's appearance belies its labor-intensive manufacture. A length measuring 20 yards by 1 yard might take a weaver anywhere from 6 to 10 months to complete, depending on the fineness. The city of Dhaka in Bengal was renowned for the fineness of its cotton due to the exceptional quality of locally grown raw material and the contributions of skilled female spinners and male embroiderers and weavers. Muslin was so prized that it was used for generations. This English apron of Indian muslin was first embroidered by Mary Green in 1713 and finished by her daughter, Mary Walsh, in 1749, and they both signed it and dated it. The 2 export shawls seen here, found in a home in Newport, Rhode Island, were acquired by me less than a month ago, are of Indian muslin embroidered in India with a technique known as chikankari. The dress here, worn by Elizabeth Patterson of Baltimore for her marriage to Jerome Bonaparte in 1803, is made of Indian muslin embroidered in the West, most likely France, and was a gift from her fiancé. The young American woman who wore this dress flaunted her daring and fashionableness. Gauze ground jamdani were the most highly prized of the many kinds of imported muslin. Woven exclusively by Muslim men, jamdani's brocaded patterns required prodigious dexterity and took longer to weave than fine muslins. Found in New England, this trained cotton dress has a relatively coarse brocaded pattern compared to Indian weaving, and is probably a Scottish imitation. And this was a discovery when we were researching this dress recently. A Scottish imitation of jamdani using a new weaving technology available in Europe. The dress we see here belonged to Catherine Beekman, the daughter of James Beekman, a prominent New York textile importer of a dry goods merchant, who later marries a New Jersey Supreme Court judge. This extravagant and refined ensemble is delicately embroidered in silk on fine English cotton, with vines of seasonal garden flowers. I'd like to think that she embroidered the dress herself, but we simply don't know. Also worn in America is this dress of Indian silver muslin, worked in a technique called silver thumbnail, a technique that was never successfully imitated in the West. And that's because the silver is pulled delicately through the muslin and then pushed down with your thumbnail. One stitch at a time. First the muslin takes forever, and then the embroidery takes another lifetime. Chinese damasks, painted silks, brocades, Indian tie-dyed silks, and modern dyed cottons. These are just some of the many fabrics that American colonists and Republicans actively bought, traded, sold, embellished, and imitated. But not all imports were cotton or silk, nor did they all originate in China and India. I want to end with a special object that takes us from the Philippines all the way back to Maine. This 1830s child's dress is made of pina cloth, an expensive and labor-intensive Filipino cloth. It was found in Hamden, Maine, and was likely acquired by a US seaman who traveled to the Philippines while en route to China. The execution of the crewel embroidery on this dress is distinctively American. From trees of life to exotic flowers to scrolling vines to even the smallest animal, the significance of Asian motifs in early American textiles can be seen all over once you start looking. Believe me when I say that there is much more to show, but these examples give a sense of the rich diversity of fabrics and of patterns that were available to New England consumers, and the ways in which they used these imports to craft a distinctively American identity. Thank you.